We've been talking about the pro-democracy rebellions that have erupted across the Middle East in recent years. The revolutions in Tunisia and Morocco have had a far more successful outcome. But what made the revolution successful in these countries but not in others? To answer that question and many more, I'm joined from Boston by Tarek Masoud, a political scientist specializing in the Middle East, and Benjamin Claude Brower, a professor from the University of Texas. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Benjamin Brower, let me start with you. The Arab Spring, as it came to be known, started off in Tunisia when a fruit vendor was assaulted, and that led to a popular uprising. You have been in Tunisia in the past few years. What kind of changes have you seen there?
I think what's important in terms of when we talk about revolution is to talk about the different manifestations of revolution. The revolution as it started in Sidi Bouzid, which is important to note, is this very far off, very small and otherwise insignificant agricultural region. The revolution that began there was about social inequalities. It was about poverty. And very quickly, the reason it became a national revolution is the middle classes also felt themselves a part of that. And so as the revolutionary dynamic moved forward, there were in many ways two competing visions of what the revolution was all about. One, for the middle classes, it was about economic and political freedoms, whereas for the popular classes, this was still very much a revolution about, in some ways, something as simple as social equality.
Let's go to Tarek Masoud in Boston. And Tarek, what has been the experience in Morocco? It is a monarchy, and there were protests there as well in February of 2011, but we saw the king there introduce reforms very quickly, perhaps to stave off a bigger insurrection that it could have seen the entire monarchy being overthrown. So what has been the experience there?
Well, I mean, the premise of the entire segment, you started by saying that both Tunisia and Morocco had successful revolutions, but of course, as your current question recognizes, the outcome in Morocco was very different from the outcome in Tunisia. In Morocco, the monarchy introduced some limited reforms, and therefore the monarchy stays in place. The protest movement in Morocco has sort of petered out, whereas obviously in Tunisia we saw a complete overhaul of the regime, and that required repeated protests actually for that to happen, but it did happen. The similarity in both cases is that you did have an election after the so-called Arab Spring in which the party in power changed. But in Morocco, there had always been, even prior to the so-called Arab Spring protests of February 2011 in that country, there had always been a much larger measure of pluralism in Morocco, particularly in among the political parties, than there was in Tunisia or any of the other cases. So I look at Morocco and I see a case of real continuity as opposed to real change. And I think in part that's because the regime in Morocco had a lot more space for the opposition to begin with. I also think that if you look throughout the Middle East, one factor that we find predicts continuity pretty well has been whether you were a monarchy or had some kind of hereditary succession, but those kinds of regimes have tended to last pretty well, and that includes Morocco, it includes all the Persian Gulf countries. So there's lots of reasons, I think, why Morocco has remained stable while other countries experience dramatic change.
Right, as you say, there was continuity in Morocco, but did you also find, as Benjamin Brower just pointed out in Tunisia, that there were two different types of grievances expressed by people? On the one hand, they were talking about the economic hardships that they were facing. On the other hand, there was another group of people, which in the case of Tunisia was the middle class, who were talking about social change, about political change.
Yeah, I think that's probably common to most revolutions. Most successful revolutions tend to be cross-class movements, and cross-class movements often involve different demands from different classes. So I don't think that Morocco and Tunisia are different in that regard. I just think that the Moroccan system was more capable of absorbing some of these demands.
Let's go back to Benjamin Brower in Texas. Benjamin, what have you seen of the changes that have taken place in Tunisia? Is it now entrenched? Because we have seen more protests. Last year in July there were protests when there was a standoff between the Ennahda party and its more secular rivals. So are we going to see more demonstrations? Are we going to see more grievances being expressed by people?
Sure. Let me just step back and just say a couple of words about the case in Morocco. And I think that this should be important to make clear to your viewers. There's not been a revolution in Morocco. You know, the process of radical political change that's implied by the word revolution has not occurred in the monarchy. And I would just concur with the idea that, you know, the monarchy as an institution is something that has a great deal of resiliency to it and a great deal of legitimacy. And I think this is very important. This was not something that the Ben Ali government in Tunisia enjoyed. And I think that, you know, in terms of, we're talking about the differences between, you know, successful or so-called failed revolutions, that, you know, the question of legitimacy is a very important one. You know, these are places that have changed dramatically over the course of neoliberal reforms. There's been a great deal of wealth that has been created in these countries, but has not been equally shared among the population. And so this opens the question of justification for these new social inequalities. In many ways, a monarchy is a situation, an institution that has different ways that it can explain social inequalities to the people, whereas in the case in Tunisia, where you have a leader who had come to power through something of a coup d'etat, who had very flagrantly consumed wealth amongst his family, you know, among sort of, if you were to rate these late 20th century dictators, amongst the pairs of shoes that they owned, for example. The wife of Ben Ali was a great collectioner of shoes, just like Emilia Marcos was in the Philippines. In the Philippines, Emilia Marcos sort of wins the game in this. She had 3,000 pair of shoes, and when Layla Ben Ali left Tunisia, they counted 1,000. But in any case, these are the sorts of things that are very difficult to explain when you don't have this long tradition of institutional authority and so forth. And I think what the Moroccans did very effectively, you know, this is something that if we look historically, I'm a historian, if we look historically at this is something that's been experienced by many different countries in the region. In the 19th century, this was the problem that was faced by Italy. And a famous phrase that I think that the Moroccans, and in many ways also their neighbors to the east, the Algerians, have learned is the Italian aristocrats said, if we want things to remain as they are, things will have to change. And I think this is something that has been taken to heart in the Moroccan monarchy.
Okay, let me get Tarek Masoud's opinion on that. Tarek, do you feel that the Moroccan monarchy still retains a lot of power, although he surrendered some of that power to a prime minister, which he surrendered in the face of protests from people in Morocco?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I just said. I think that the Moroccan regime, as I noted, has managed to persist, whereas others in the region have fallen. And one hypothesis is, as I noted, that there's something special about monarchy or hereditary regimes more broadly. But there's also other hypotheses about why Morocco and Tunisia diverge. I mean, it's also important to note that Tunisia, I don't think, for example, the corruption of the Tunisian leading family, the Ben Ali family and the family of his wife, Trabelsi, I don't think that their corruption was necessarily more flagrant than the corruption of the Moroccan or any other regime. But I do think that the society in Tunisia is a lot more developed. If you just look at their gross economic indicators, Tunisia has a much higher per capita income than Morocco does. It has a much larger middle class than Morocco does, a much more educated population than Morocco does. And in part, one thing that we've known about studying democracy and how you get democracy over the last 50 years is that, you know, having more educated, affluent populations tends to be correlated with democratization or demands for democratization. So I think it not only was is there maybe something special about monarchy, but also maybe something about the societies, that the Tunisian society had a lot more capacity to resist the regime and demand change than the Moroccan society did. Of course, we're only looking at two cases here, and we have a wealth of potential explanations for their divergence, so we're never going to be able to nail the reason, at least with these two cases, but these are important things to think about.
Right, we will be looking, we have been looking at other countries as well. Benjamin Brower, let's look at the role of the United States in these changes that have been taking place in the Middle East. Was the United States taken by surprise when these protests erupted in places like Tunisia, in places like Morocco, and especially in Egypt?
I think in terms of the perspective of Washington, I don't think that the fact that there would be mass protests against the government would be something that would surprise policymakers in the United States. I think what would have been a surprise, and I think what was a surprise, was the fact that these led to meaningful political change. You know, an actual dictator who was forced to leave the country through popular street protests. And I think this is something that no one would have expected at the particular time. You know, in terms of the development afterwards, you know, I think that Washington recognized very quickly as Islamist political parties moved forward in the process that these were people that represented no sort of threat to the world system that Washington embraces and led forth. You know, that they were willing to work in terms of the international economic reforms, be a part of the world system centered in Washington. So I think in many ways, even if these revolutions quickly turned green, if you were, to move towards an Islamic trend, that this was something that Washington was very willing to work with.
Tarek, do you agree that there was a fear in Washington during these changes that were taking place that Islamist parties would come to power and that they would pose a threat?
I think certainly there was some concern that Islamists would come to power throughout the Middle East if democratic elections were introduced. And the fear was twofold. On the one hand, it was that these Islamic parties, if they came to power, would directly threaten U.S. interests. And the second fear was that they would introduce illiberal regimes within their own countries, and so they would dial back what limited progress had been made in arenas like women's rights and respect for religious minorities. And these are two distinct fears, and I think from the standpoint of U.S. policymakers, the former fear was much more important than the latter fear. The former fear being that these Islamists would somehow change their country's foreign policies in ways that were inimical to America's interests. So maybe they would stop cooperating with the United States on counterterrorism. Maybe they would take a much more rejectionist line when it came to making peace between Israelis and Palestinians. That they would even enact policies that might somehow limit the free flow of oil. And I think what Islamists throughout the region, at least the Islamists who got elected, and I'm particularly thinking about those in Tunisia and in Egypt, which is, of course, much more geostrategically important than either of the cases we're talking about today, I think Islamists really very quickly allayed U.S. fears on that front. We found in the Tunisian case and in the Egyptian case that they were quite willing to continue the foreign policies of their predecessors because they deemed those foreign policies to be in their own national interest as well. On the latter fear, though, the fear that they would introduce more illiberal, less tolerant regimes, right, I think that fear did come true.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Tarek Masoud, thanks for joining us. Benjamin Brower, thanks for joining us.